But their reaction reveals more about their hearts than they realize. While Mary is very clearly treasuring Jesus above all else, his own disciples are still thinking in very this worldly terms. Now, Jesus' words here have often been taken out of context and used to try to argue that the church need not worry about the plight of the poor, because after all, they're always going to exist. And such interpreters take Jesus to be advocating a complete lack of concern for the physical care of the downtrodden. But that's not at all his point here. Jesus' point is that he won't be with his disciples for very much longer. His death is only days away. Therefore, their care for the poor can wait until after the cross. At that point in time, the physical presence of Jesus was what mattered the most. But it seems that the disciples still did not want to accept the prospect of their master dying before he could take his throne and reign as king over Israel. They still weren't clear about Jesus' earthly mission. And the reality is that the disciples probably weren't all that concerned about helping the poor. Saying that was just a way of saving face about just how aghast they were about what Mary was doing. In fact, in John's gospel, we learn that Judas is actually the one who voices this concern. And John tells us that he does so, quote, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So the concern of Judas, and probably of the rest of the disciples, was not a genuine concern, but merely a bit of virtue signaling. And all they really do is show just how skewed their values still are. They're more concerned with the waste of the oil than they are with honoring the Son of God in their midst. But while it's easy for us to read this and shake our fingers at the disciples for their lack of honor, we need to remember that our own values can be just as skewed, sometimes on a daily basis. And of course, we don't have Jesus in our midst the way that they did, but we displayed just how devoted to Christ we are, with all of the things that we give our time and attention and our money to. Earlier in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is recorded as saying, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Therefore, we all need to ask that question of ourselves. Where is my ultimate treasure? Of course, there are many different vain things that we can treasure in this world. Various types of entertainment, social media, pets, cars, houses, and yes, even books. But there are those things that actually are very important. Your kids, your spouse, your financial security, your health, all important. But do we end up elevating those things to a level where only Christ should be? If we're honest with ourselves, we have to say that most of the time, Jesus is not our ultimate treasure, because so many things vie for our attention and win. Jesus wants our hearts. He wants all of who we are. But where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So how we respond to the call of Jesus on a daily basis is often no better than how his disciples responded at that dinner table in Bethany. And so it's that kind of mindset that naturally leads into the next scene in our text, the initial act of Jesus' betrayal. Looking at verses 14 through 16 again, we read, Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, What will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him. Now, it's not easy to explain why one of the few people that Jesus had handpicked to be a disciple would just betray him so easily. Perhaps Judas never was fully devoted to Jesus. Maybe he was just curious and wanted to follow this man who claimed to be the Messiah to see where it might lead. Maybe he thought that he would enjoy some political clout once Jesus took the throne, but then realized at some point that Jesus was not going to be that kind of Messiah. Or maybe Judas was at first fully devoted to Jesus, but later his selfishness and greed began to get the best of him, until he finally decided to give into it and fall back into his sinful lifestyle, and that he wanted nothing to do with Jesus. We saw that in John's gospel,